This is Note Taker 20 on Kingdom Protista, also known as Protists. This kingdom, Kingdom Protista, is probably going to be the one that is going to be a little tougher for y'all to grasp because it's not going to be as familiar to you as the other kingdoms that we're going to study. Now, as we start talking about the different members of this kingdom, you might recognize a few, but with a little extra studying, you'll be able to get this no problem. Now, members of the Kingdom Protista, they are going to belong to the domain Eukarya, which means they are eukaryotes. Eu means true, karyon means nucleus. You can find these on the word wall in the classroom. So eukaryotes are any type of life form that has a nucleus protecting the genetic material in their cells. With our protists, we break them into three groups based on characteristics that their cells have. We break them into plant-like protists, and we're going to see that these cells are going to have characteristics similar to plant cells. Animal-like protists will have cells with characteristics similar to animal cells. And then we will have fungus-like protists, which again will be similar to fungus cells. Now, with each of your protists, they are going to be unicellular, meaning that they are made up of one single cell. We're going to start today with our plant-like protists. Plant-like protists, just like plants, are going to be autotrophs. And if you remember from the last note taker, and you can refer to the word wall, an autotroph means self-feeder. They are going to use the energy from the sun to make their own food. And we're going to look at three different types. We're going to look at euglenas, diatoms, and dinoflagellates in this note taker. Now, starting with euglenas. Euglenas can have lots of different shapes, but there are three characteristics that no matter what shape it is, they will all share. The first characteristic is that they have a pouch. The pouch is going to hold two flagella. Remember from the last note taker, flagella is a whip-like tail for movement, and one of the flagella is going to be much longer than the other. They're going to have a reddish eye spot, and we're going to talk in just a few minutes about what that's for. And finally, they are going to need chloroplasts to absorb the sun's energy so that they can make their food. Here in the picture, on the left is a picture of a euglena under the microscope. On the right side, we have someone who has done a drawing of that euglena. And you'll notice through the picture that each of the structures are labeled. So if we start at the top, the flagella is the whip-like tail coming from the pouch. By the flagella, we have a reddish eye spot. The larger green structures throughout the cell are going to be your chloroplasts. The large brown structure is the nucleus, which is going to house the genetic material. And then on the outside of the euglena, instead of a cell membrane or a cell wall, we have something called a pellicle. This pellicle is going to be a much thicker but still flexible covering similar to a cell membrane. Now, the flagella is used for movement. The pellicle is used to protect the outer or the euglena, and the eye spot. The eye spot is not going to see like you and I can look around the room and see. It's not going to look around the room and go, oh, look, there's Miss Ennis. However, the eye spot is sensitive to light. This is going to help the euglena determine where there's light and where it's dark. The euglena is going to want to move into the light because that's what it uses to produce its food through the process of photosynthesis. The next group of plant-like protists are called diatoms, and you can see in the picture below that your diatoms come in many, many different shapes. They are going to be among the most numerous of all of our protists. They are also photosynthetic, which means that they use the sun's energy to make their food. Your diatoms are going to have a two-part glassy shell, and when they die, their shells sink to the bottom and form layers of what we call diatomaceous earth. We actually collect this diatomaceous earth, and if we use it in its coarse form where we don't grind it down, then we can put it into filters, we can use it in insulation, we can mix it into road paint. And if we mix it into road paint, it actually kind of gives road paint a little sparkle when your headlights hit it at night, making the lines on the road more visible. Now, if we grind it down to a powdery form, we can mix it with car polishes and toothpaste. It's a great polishing agent for us to use. The third type of plant-like protists that we're going to talk about are called dinoflagellates. These are actually going to have a cell wall and two flagella. One of the flagella is going to trail behind it like a tail. The other is going to wrap around it almost like a little belt. So as the tail behind it pushes it forward, the flagella around it, like a belt, is going to cause it to spin. So it's going to look like a little spinning top as it goes through the water. Most of your dinoflagellates are going to live in salt water, and most of them are food products for larger animals. When your dinoflagellates reproduce too rapidly, which means we've got too many nutrients in the water and they cause them to go crazy reproducing, we get a little problem. That problem is called red tide. Dinoflagellates, because they need to be at the surface of the water to get the sunlight so they could get their food source, when they produce too rapidly, we have too many in the water, and they start to fight each other to get to that top so that they can get the sunlight. Well, your dinoflagellates actually produce a toxin to try to kill each other off. The only problem with that is that toxin actually kills other stuff that's also in the water. Now, with a red tide, they do call it a red tide because it does look like the water is red. And on the next slide, you'll see pictures of this. It almost looks like the water is blood. And the toxin, you're going to end up with a huge mess afterwards because the toxin's killing most of your sea life that's there. So once a red tide passes through, you're going to have all sorts of dead fish, dolphins, things like that washing up on shore that need to be cleaned up. Now, humans, if we go into the water when there's a red tide, that toxin can absorb into our skin and make us very ill. Also, we have to be careful that we give it time after the red tide passes, because sometimes the fish that do live can absorb that toxin, and we need to be careful not to eat those fish because they could also make us sick when we eat them. Now, when dinoflagellates are happy, or in their good state where they're not reproducing too quickly, some dinoflagellates actually glow, and they produce a really cool glowing light, almost like little fireflies on the surface of the water. And you'll see that picture in a couple of slides. The top picture shows dinoflagellates under a microscope, and the picture on the right-hand side shows what a red tide looks like. And that is from a helicopter up in the sky taking a picture down on this red tide. You can see the water does look very red because of the color of these dinoflagellates. Now, during this time, with this red tide, this whole span of beach would be closed so that they try to protect and keep people out of the water so that people don't get sick. Here are dinoflagellates in their happy state glowing. The first picture shows a boat trail that was left behind. The boat's long gone, but as it agitated the water, it excited the dinoflagellates and they all started to glow. The picture on the top right is a kayaker, and as the boat's passing through the water and they're rowing with their oar, you see that as the water gets agitated, it causes the little dinoflagellates to glow. And the bottom picture actually shows a person in the water. Now here, when they're in their happy state, they're not producing a toxin, so you can actually be in the water with them. And this guy's kind of doing the movement almost like a little snow angel, where he's waving his arms, and as it moves the water, the little dinoflagellates are getting excited and glowing, and you can see them glowing around him. The next group of protists are animal-like protists, and unlike the plant-like protists, which were autotrophs like plants, your animal-like protists are going to be heterotrophs like we are. They need to find food to get their energy. And we do call your animal-like protists protozoa, which if you look on the word wall means first animal. Scientists do believe that these may have been what evolved into our first animal life. Their cells are going to be very similar to animal cells. They do contain a nucleus, and they do not have a cell wall, because our cells don't have a cell wall. And we're going to look at 4 groups of these: our sarcodines, ciliates, zooflagellates, and sporozoans. Your sarcodines you may have heard about under a different name. One of the types of sarcodines is called an amoeba, and I will show you a picture on the next slide. Your sarcodines are going to move about by pushing out their cell membranes. They're going to use their cytoplasm to push their cell membrane out to almost make something that looks like a little arm or leg. These are called pseudopods. Pseudo means false, pod means foot. You can find those on the word wall. Some of these pseudopods are used for movement, while others help the amoeba gather its food, because these are heterotrophs and they do need to hunt for their food. Some of your sarcodines will have a shell for support and protection, and once they die, the shells sink to the bottom, and we can actually collect this and make chalk out of it. The most familiar type of sarcodine I mentioned earlier is the amoeba. The amoeba is a freshwater protist, and they have inside of them a special structure called a contractile vacuole. When we talked about diffusion earlier this year, we know that water moves from a high concentration to a low concentration. So with an amoeba living in fresh water, water is constantly trying to move into the amoeba cell. However, if it gets too much water, it can cause damage to the amoeba. So this special vacuole, which remember from first 9 weeks, your vacuole is a storage tank. This is one that collects the water and removes it from the amoeba cell to keep the amoeba safe. Amoebas are also very sensitive to light and chemicals. Because they do not use the sun's energy to make food, they don't want to be in the light. They actually will move to the dimmer areas or darker areas in the water. And we can tell water quality because if we find amoebas in the water, then the water quality may be pretty good because they don't like a lot of pollution and will actually move away from it. On the top picture, that's an amoeba under a microscope, and the bottom picture shows one that's hand-drawn. In your notes, you may need to label these pictures. On the outside of the amoeba, you will find a cell membrane. On the inside, you will find some food vacuoles, you will find the nucleus, and you will find the contractile vacuole, which in this picture is represented by the empty white circle. Also on the left side of the drawn picture, you will see the pseudopods and how they're surrounding a food particle to take that in and eat it. Now, in class we will talk more about amoebas, and I want to tell you that not all amoebas are good, but you'll have to wait to class to find out why. Your ciliates are the second type of animal-like protists we're going to talk about, and they are named for the cilia, which are the tiny hair-like projections all over the outside of the cell. Now on the next slide I will show you a picture of these, and what you're going to notice is it looks like a little hairy jelly bean. So the little hairs that you're seeing are cilia, and they're going to move and help the ciliate in two ways. One, it's going to help it swim through its environment, and number two, it's going to start to create a current in the little water around it to help sweep food towards the organism so that it can feed. The paramecium will have a thick outer coating called a pellicle, just like our euglena did. Except our paramecia is now going to have a little opening called an oral groove. Food will enter that oral groove and go into what is called a gullet, where a food vacuole will form around the food particle. After the food digests, the waste products are then moved from a vacuole to what is called an anal pore, which is a special opening on the paramecium for waste products to be expelled or removed. Paramecium are actually a type of ciliate that are going to have two nuclei. The large nucleus is going to be like the regular nucleus inside of our bodies. It's going to take care of all of our functions of life. However, there is a smaller nucleus inside the paramecium which will be used for conjugation. And we talked about conjugation with bacteria. This is when two paramecium will line up side by side, form a little tube, and they will swap out some of their genetic material. They will do this again when the environment is not very favorable, and they can swap it out to change their genetic code to maybe help them survive a little bit better. The top picture is a paramecium under the microscope, and the bottom one is a hand-drawn that shows you all the parts. We do have the cilia, which are the hair-like structures. The mouth pore is another name for the oral groove. The macronucleus is the large nucleus that controls all of the parts of all of the functions of the cell. And the micronucleus, which is right by it, is the one that controls conjugation. Your anal pore is where the waste is removed, and your contractile vacuole is what is going to keep these paramecium from expanding too much, because like the amoeba, they live in fresh water and need a way to get the excess water out of their cell so that they don't get damaged. Zooflagellates and sporozoans are the last two animal-like protists we're going to talk about. Your zooflagellates, like their name, they are going to have flagella to move around, and the one thing I want you to know about your zooflagellates is where they're located. Termites eat wood. Termites cannot digest wood, so they have these zooflagellates living in their intestines that help them break down the wood particles so that they can get the nutrients. And then the last type of animal-like protist is your sporozoan. Your sporozoans are going to be parasites, which means they're bad for you. They are going to feed on the cells and the body fluids of their host animal. Now, sporozoans are going to have a little bit different of a life cycle than some of our other protists. They are going to start by forming cells called spores. When the spore becomes injected inside the host cell, it's going to divide to form a lot more spores. And then a few days later, the spores will burst open, and the sporozoans will then travel throughout the body, infecting the host. If a carrier comes along, like a mosquito or a fly or something like that, that bites the infected host, then the sporozoan will then be transferred to other living things by this carrier. One of the sporozoans we are going to talk about in class is malaria, but we will talk more about those and a few others in class, and I will show you more examples. The top picture here is a picture of a zooflagellate, and the bottom here is a sporozoan. The last group of protists is going to be our fungus-like protists. These are ones that are going to be heterotrophs, which means they have to find food like a fungus cell does, but they're going to have a cell wall. So they're going to be heterotrophs like an animal cell and have a cell wall like a plant cell. These are two characteristics that our fungus is going to have, and you're going to see that when we actually study the fungal kingdom. And your fungus-like protists are going to reproduce by spores, like our fungus does. Spores are going to be tiny cells that are going to be able to grow into the new organism. We're going to have three types of fungus-like protists that I'm going to show you in this note taker: water molds, downy mildews, and slime molds. Your water molds and your downy mildew are going to have a fuzzy appearance, and they're going to live in water or in moist environments. And a lot of times these can become a pest to farmers when there may be too much rain or they may overwater their crops, because these will actually attack the crops and ruin the plant so that it can't be sold for food. Your slime molds are going to live in moist soil or on decaying plants and trees. They can be found in many different habitats, and sometimes your slime molds will come in very creative colors. The one I'm going to show you on the next slide is actually a pink color. Now, your slime molds are able to move around a lot like your amoebas. They're going to have pseudopods, and they're going to feed on bacteria and other microorganisms. Here's a picture of the three examples. The first one is a water mold, and in this picture, what you're seeing in the center that looks almost like an insect is actually a baby dragonfly larva. It is dead. The water mold has surrounded it, and it's now feeding off of the body of the dead dragonfly larva. In the second picture is a spinach leaf, and what looks all gray and fuzzy on that is called downy mildew. And once this crop of spinach gets this downy mildew on it, a farmer is not able to sell this. It's actually ruined the crop. The bottom picture shows a slime mold, and you can see it does look very slimy. This is not something you'd want to touch with your hand if you saw it. If you took a stick and poked at it, these are not little bubbles. They will not pop. It's just like an ooey, gooey slime mold on the ground. We will talk more about each of these protists, and I will show you more examples in class. Please do not forget to do the assessment following the note taker.